Hello, Wexford students. So this week I'm going to briefly go through this slideshow so that you have something to look at. It's not in its completed form, so I'm going to whiz through this on rider postures with lines of force. This is similar to the horse posture slideshow, and it's still going to take me another week or so to refine this slideshow and do it in a more finished form. But I wanted you to have it this week to have a look at. Okay, so this first slide, the box, the ball, and the tee, and what we think about as we ride. So the illustration is just to show we straddle the horse's thorax, which is the thoracic spine, the rib cage, the sternum, which moves and acts sort of like a ball. This is where this crosshairs of the rider and the sort of ball around the rider and horse. This describes the intersection of forces. So where the rider receives all the forces of motion from the horse is really mostly through our seat bones, up our spine, through our torso, in our core. So in the box, the ball, the tee, the little black star is basically where the rider sits. And then the illustration, you'll see a vertical line and a horizontal line as a crosshairs, basically through about the midsection of the rider. A little bit on the low side because when we ride, our point of balance drops a little bit. The outer circle sort of describes what we feel, right? How we feel the entire horse through our seat, which is our whole axial skeleton and our torso, our arms, and our legs. We feel the cervical spine, thoracic spine, lumbar, sacrum, pelvis, and how the horse is using it in any given moment. So you can pause here if you want to read it, but the photo with the three lines and the star is basically describing the point of balance, which is different than the center of mass. Point of balance is a movable, kind of like a center of rotation that the body organizes around. The point of balance describes where the three planes of a three-dimensional body intersect. So again, we have our vertical line from the rider's head to through the seat bones. We have a horizontal line, which really shows the levelness or lack thereof of the rider's pelvis. And then a lateral line, which was a little hard to draw, but you get the point, going left to right through the rider. I put this picture in because I use a lot of getting your sea legs or surfing kind of analogies, because what we cope with if we're on a boat or in these surfing photos is the ocean especially, but any body of water generates a lot of force. It's constant motion. It's not very predictable. When we think of our balance that way, we think of the horse as a force of motion, like the ocean or any body of water. We can balance over that. We don't have to control it in order to control ourselves. So in these two pictures of the surfers, you see I drew a white vertical line that's just 90 degrees to gravity and put it through the center of the rider's torso. So you see how even in a crouched position and looking where we're going, maybe the head, spine, pelvis, the head might be a little off because you have to look where you're going. In the photo on the left, where the rider is on a longboard and it's a less crouched position, a smaller wave or smaller amount of force, she's using her arms a bit to balance. And you can see she's got kind of her body divided with the seat and pelvis on one side and the upper back and head on the other side. And you can see how she counterbalances her body to put the center on that vertical line. The same with the picture on the left. The guy is on a short board on a much bigger wave. They call them shredders. And he's really not using his arms at all. And what I love about surfing images is it sort of puts in our mind as a rider that if it's possible for a human body to just balance on a surfboard. There's nothing to hang on to, there's nothing to grip. If you get too tight or too loose, you're off. Luckily, you fall in the water instead of the hard ground. But basically, managing the forces of motion has nothing to do with controlling the horse, just like a surfer cannot control the wave. So, what we're going to look at in this video or this slideshow is here is an illustration of the rider's skeleton, again with the vertical line of force, the horizontal line of force, the alignment. The horizontal balance should be parallel to gravity. The vertical alignment of the rider perpendicular to gravity at a 90-degree angle. The point of balance or center of rotation for the body somewhere around the belly button down towards the pelvis for a rider, because we need to keep our center a little bit lower. If we move our center of our point of balance up higher in the rib cage, we become top heavy. So also in this illustration, the rider's weight is equally distributed. So you can see I haven't filled in yet all of the written material for the point of balance, vertical alignment, horizontal alignment. That will have some written material. And then also this black line is just the line of gravity. And then the illustration shows how we affect the ball, which is the horse, in a neutral, self-controlled self-carriage when we're in this balance on the back of a horse. This is the muscular support we actually use. So our muscular support is deep in the body, near the bone. So the adductors, the muscles just along the spine, the psoas, the core muscles, the blue line kind of outlines where our muscular effort and energy is going to be to support this posture over a moving force, to maintain our balance over a moving force. Then I found these great pictures of little kids. And I go, little kids are still doing it pretty naturally. So on the left is just this little boy. Neither kid has stirrups. They're in a little pony saddle. And the little boy his axial skeleton is just so beautifully balanced. There's ease through his whole body. He doesn't have muscular strength at his age, but he still has the postural muscles that keep us upright. So he can balance on this little pony beautifully. And then on the right-hand side, the girl, I particularly liked this picture because she's talking to somebody and she's distracted. Her head is turned, her one arm is lifted, but you can see the softness through her appendicular skeleton, her arms and legs, very soft, just hanging. And even with her head turned, that line, if I put the crosshairs over there for the vertical alignment of the skeleton and the horizontal alignment, particular our front back balance is the alignment of the pelvis, you see the point of balance is still lovely. And I go, leave it. When we're still under 12 years old, what happens is because our bodies are changing every day, we're in a growth phase as a human, we rearrange our balance daily just to function. After the age of 12, as we get into our teenage years, we start to solidify our habits. But little kids, 12 and under, adapt to riding very quickly just because the body is in a high rate of change during our growth phase anyways. So these were just great pictures because they also show older people and very young people. It's not about strength to get your balance. Balance is a coordination that doesn't require a ton of muscular strength, just enough to keep our bodies upright and adjusting over a moving force. This is the same girl in a rising trot, and gotta love it, without stirrups. I'm even showing the line of force through the horse. The horse is in a tiny bit of extension. The blue line shows sort of the line of force for the horse. So with the horse, a tiny bit in spinal extension, that's a bouncy trot. And yet, in the rising trot, with her hands just gripping the front of the saddle, there's a little strap there. It keeps her arms long, and she has to figure out how to absorb that bounce of the pony's trot and go into the rise. And you can see she's not gripping with the legs. Her legs are pretty soft. Her arms are long. She's doing it from those core muscles again. And then in the sit on the right hand picture, you can see she's stabilized there in the sit with the head a tiny bit ahead of the vertical and the seat counterbalancing that, slightly like the position the surfers had on the surfboards. That's the rising trot or 2-point or jumping. It is more similar to the posture or the use organization of what the surfers were showing on especially the big wave. So the rising trot is a little tiny subtle version of that same use of the body. And here this little girl is just demonstrating this beautifully. Now here I put this in because this is so fascinating. We do a lot of riding instruction where we try to get people to find their balance by taking away the hands. And in the first pictures, giving the hands something to do actually facilitated the balance of both little kids. Here, when she's following the instruction of the instructor with the best of intentions, now you can see her little legs are gripping, her little arms are stiff, her torso is behind the vertical, her head is tilted forward and to one side, and she's having to go to muscular energy to try to figure out how to balance. Where with her hands pushed down, giving her hands something to do and pushing down on the front of the saddle, her overall balance of her axial skeleton was far superior than what you see here. I just thought that was fascinating because we do that trying to help, and here you have to assess it's just not working. It's not helping this little rider's body develop the habit of good use. It's actually taking her away from good use. Okay, then we have the issues with balance that are very common. This one we call behind the vertical or a sitting armchair position, sitting in a chair posture. You can see in this slide, and let me go back just a quick moment. In this one, the posture of the rider is more like a standing posture. And looking for the feeling of standing for the rider is very important. But a lot of times we think because we describe it, we sit in the saddle because we're balancing on our pelvis rather than our feet. We think of it as sitting, and this is often the posture that people gravitate to. Or if the horse is hard to ride, this becomes a posture that makes the rider feel safer. Now here, I just put in the point of balance, and I would like your feedback if the lines of force would be helpful or not helpful. I'll show you here in the opposite posture. I put in more a diagram of the direction of the body, but I left out the point of balance. Where here, I just showed the point of balance is shifted back and down, especially relative to the vertical line. Then here are the same picture with two different illustrations, and I'm going to leave both in. So on the left, I have the ideal crosshairs of a true 90-degree vertical line and a true 0-degree horizontal line, putting it through the center of the rider. So you can see if you're putting that ideal crosshair over the rider that's in front of you, it's pretty quick to assess to go, oh, she's behind the vertical with the bulk of her body, right? Especially if you just look at the axial skeleton, it's behind the vertical. Then if you look at the appendicular skeleton, particularly the legs, have to counterbalance her body. When the torso is behind the vertical, the legs lift and come forward energetically and go in front of the vertical. So in a sense, she's stabilized herself by putting the upper part of her body behind and the lower part of her body in front. And then the blue line through from the point of the horse's hip, the hip joint, through the center of the torso to the lower cervical vertebra is how I came up with the blue line. You can see that that's downhill. So the horse is forward with too much weight on the forehand. In the second picture on the right, I adjusted the red lines to go through the center of the rider's head and torso to the seat bones. So you can see it's curved backwards. And then I adjusted the horizontal line to match the direction of her pelvis, which is tilted up in front, down in back. Then the yellow line is how the rider's entire body is acting again on the horse. So the rider's weight and mass through the yellow line is creating a line of force that the horse is receiving as sort of coming forward and downward. So we call this acting back to front on the horse's back. This is going to overstimulate the long back muscle that's attached to the spine in 45-degree fascicles or muscular attachments to the facets from back to front. So the long back muscle is going to have to contract against the rider's weight, acting on that more than the multifidus muscle. Okay, so then what does that look like? Here's just some samples that I pulled that are, here's a guy at a horse show. And again, I just put in the vertical line in red and the line through the head, the spine, into the seat bones, and even the thighs. You can see it's curved backwards where the rider's weight is acting back to front, literally sort of energetically pushing the horse forward and down. And the same thing, this is not, and both of these can be the fashion. The top one is currently more the fashion of competitive dressage, and the lower one is kind of the fashion of Western riding. And it dynamically is going to have the effect whether we like it or not. And I put again the illustration with the rider in behind the vertical position, the skeleton, and drawing with the line of force on how it influences the horse from back, forward, and down, with the point of balance being shifted in the rider back and down. Then we have the opposite imbalance, front back balance, of, and you can see the front back balance and the vertical balance are tightly aligned, especially because we're vertical creatures. So if we go a little bit out of balance front to back, we completely lose our vertical alignment. So in this illustration, the black line is the vertical line at 90 degrees to gravity. And then instead of putting in the point of balance, I just drew the line of force through the rider and how the rider's weight is pushed forward. So I'd really like you guys to let me know if this is a better illustration or putting in the point of balance. I'm kind of playing between the two, or I could do a page where I show both. And then what that looks like. So I'll put in a description. That part isn't written yet. But what that looks like. So this is a particularly challenging arrangement of our body for female riders. So I picked this close-up where it was really apparent. And again, on the left side, I just put in the ideal crosshair. And I couldn't really put in the line of force for the horse because it's not showing too well. But I put the vertical line and the horizontal line in on how the rider is. And you can see where she is dropped forward in the pelvis, if you look at her pelvis relative to the horizontal line, and slightly ahead of the vertical line if we put that crosshairs up against what she's actually doing. Then in the lower picture on the right-hand side, you can see that if I follow the line of the spine, it's a forward curve through the spine. So her low back is pulling her spine more forward through her body. This is so common for women who are told shoulders back. We have a different shaped lumbar and pelvis, and how we come to the same vertical arrangement as a male body is a different organization to get to the same place. But a lot of the current riding instruction works very well for the male physique, but not as well for the female. So this is quite a common problem with female riders. So the red lines are showing the actual uses of the head, spine, pelvis is the vertical line. And the angle of the pelvis is the horizontal red line, which is high behind, low in front. Then the yellow line is showing how the rider's overall posture, weight, and mass is acting towards the horse, pushing our weight from the front backwards and down into the horse. And the horse will contract the opposite back muscle, the multifidus muscle, which is attached to the spine in 45-degree fascicles or muscular attachments from front to back. So this horse is contracting the deeper multifidus muscle against the use of the rider. And the blue line shows from the point of the horse's hip down towards the base of the neck kind of a severe downward slope. And even though you can barely sort of see the neck from the mane is headed up, that would show that the horse is in extension because the blue line is actually severely high behind in the croup and low in front towards the neck. So the horse is pulling upward muscularly because the spine is pushing down, which could just be the horse's habit, but the rider's use in this picture is not helping that. Okay, so again, here's our skeleton in the two forward ahead of the vertical posture with the point of balance pulled upward and forward and the line of force acting against the horse from the front of the rider's body back and down, which may have the effect of the horse contracting the lower back, which would push the pelvis and the hind legs to rotate more backwards and be less comfortable coming forward and underneath the rider. And then these photos are just examples. So the upper left-hand photo is a very subtle example, but the rider's arms are very tight because the pelvis, and you can maybe zoom in on this or try to get the page larger, but the rider's pelvis, the overall position looks pretty good, but there's a small contraction in the rider's back, and so the result is her tightening her arms. And I know this because it's me and I do it, right? You can see the line of force in the reins. There's a tiny bit of pulling action with muscular contraction in the arms because the pelvis got slightly pulled forward. In the next picture on the black and white horse, you can see more obviously the rider's low back is pulled forward and her head is thrown back. And then her heels are pushed down as a counterbalance. This is typical of how a female responds to the instruction, look where you're going, shoulders back, heels down. It actually doesn't encourage the right balance in a female rider. And that's the photo on the upper right-hand side. The lower left-hand side is a typical female body struggling with just even getting in the saddle, having the regular habit of arching the spine forward. So her lower thoracic and her entire lumbar, all the muscles around there are contracting and pulling the spine too far forward, which kind of, I could say, disengages the lower abdominal muscles on the front half of the pelvis. It actually contracts the psoas and makes the upper legs tighten. And even though she doesn't have her heels pushed down, right, it's not a bad overall posture, but with her pelvis slightly tipped forward and her back contracting, pulling her whole body weight forward, and then her legs either have to grip or her seat bones aim backwards towards the horse's hind legs. Not a stable position, also called launch position. Then the lower right corner is a rider who really looks pretty good, but you can see in the low back, even though it's mostly flat, very contracted. And in a different slideshow, I have sort of her process, but that's a very subtle version. She's actually controlling the levelness of her pelvis. She's controlling her legs. She's controlling her shoulders are actually a tad far behind her hip joint, not over her hip joint. So again, this is what we're told is good posture. Her sternum is lifting up, and she's having to really contract her low back muscles. That particular rider was riding an off-the-track thoroughbred who was not going to have it and was reactive, even though her posture is really pretty good. It's a detail, but it's a very important detail in what the horse feels from the rider. Okay, here's the lateral balance. This is the ideal. We see our vertical line, we see our horizontal line. So whether we're looking at the rider from the side view, which would be the vertical line, and the horizontal line, the side view of the pelvis, if we look from the back, it's really the same crosshairs, because now we're looking left to right, the shoulders, the hips, the knees, the ankles, the feet, right? Even the thigh bones. This is why you can check your own thigh bones when you ride. And if they're not symmetrical to each other, your pelvis is probably not level over gravity. So on the left, we have our vertical line of force. We have the rider's point of balance, kind of low, maybe behind the navel or just above the pelvis, somewhere in there, and centered. The spine, skull, and pelvis of the rider is in a straight line of force. That's the vertical line. And horizontally, the rider feels and looks. Feeling is a whole different topic. We'll get into that, but at least looks symmetrical. Arms hanging equally, legs hanging equally is the result of the pelvis being level and stable. And this is a tricky one for all horses and riders, because bodies, even though we're built semi-symmetrically, we don't function symmetrically. We're all right-handed, left-handed. We all have a tendency to overuse one side of our body or the other. So this is a particularly tricky aspect, and where eyes on the ground or photos or video is especially helpful, because what it feels like and what it looks like is where the helmet fire begins. Okay, so here, and I don't think I did this on the first skeleton, the balance from the side view. I might need to go back and enter it if you guys like this. This is the muscular support. I might have done it, I can't remember. But anyways, the muscular support, you can see, is almost a narrow triangular tower where we really, and again, this is the postural muscles. These are the muscles along the spine, along the front and back of the pelvis that we use to just be upright. That's why I particularly like those photos of the little kids. They don't have a lot of muscular strength, and yet their balance was very good. And then the blue line across the bottom showing, that's basically what the line of the saddle is. So when people ask me about saddles, I go, it needs to be neutral. It's just to help with a base of support, but you can see our body still has to balance left to right in a saddle. What saddle fitters like to do is flock the saddle to keep the rider level, and they'll flock the saddle asymmetrically if the horse's back is asymmetric. Then we feel the levelness, but that doesn't help the horse change at all. So I like a saddle that's neutral, where the seat bones of the rider have to go, should be flat and level. It should be level front to back, left to right, just enough to support the balance. You can see we're balancing the entire axial skeleton on two little points. It's not huge. And then right up the spine, the sacrum, the lumbar, the thoracic, the cervical, and the skull all have to balance on these tiny two little points. So the saddle allows the upper thigh to help and gives us kind of a more stable platform on which to balance. Okay, what happens when lateral balance goes wrong? So in these two illustrations, the horse is in what would be called dorsal tips left, or technically right rotation, which means the left side of the horse's barrel is lower. The right side is compensating with severe muscular contraction. So the upward force comes on the right side of the rider. So this rider in the illustration is succumbing to that force. Again, what it feels like is the rider feels equal weight in the stirrups and equal weight on the seat bones, because the horse's back is changing its shape. So we can't look for equal weight on our seat bones, equal weight in our stirrups to feel straight. We need a different thing to focus on, and we'll get into that later. So on the left, the diagram of the blue triangle is the muscular effort of the rider. So the point of balance, the red dot, has shifted lower and towards the left half of the pelvis. It's just a little bit left of the spine and downward. So the muscular energy this rider is having to do is contracting. So the left shoulder is pulled up as a counterbalance to the opposite seat, or to the seat bone going down on the same side. So on the left shoulder is pulled up because the left leg is falling down. So all of that muscular effort is on the left, maybe from the bottom of the thoracic spine up through the neck. There's severe contraction of the rider on the left-hand side. And then as you get to the lumbar and the point of balance, it's going to shift to the rider's right side. So the right low back, all the muscles around the right side of the pelvis, and all the muscles of the right leg are going to be working really hard. And all the muscles of the left upper part of the torso on the rider are going to be working really hard. So that counterbalance of muscular effort makes the rider feel straight, but they're not feeling their own muscular effort. So the diagram on the right with the arrows are the lines of force that in this use of our body, which is an imbalance, but we feel countered balance. That's how we don't fall off, right? So if we didn't compensate with our muscle energy, we would fall off of this horse. But when we compensate, the line of force that we are creating into the horse's back from our weight, mass, and muscular energy is, you can see it goes a little to the right through the head and the cervical spine. Then it shifts left through the thoracic. It goes from upper thoracic, it's over on the right. So we're creating a little bit of force there with our upper body, and then our lower body is really creating the line of force downward to the horse's left side, which is where the problem already is. So we're just making it a little bit worse. So on the left is the muscular use of the rider, and on the right are the forces felt by the horse from this arrangement of the rider. And again, here's an example. On the left is just the crosshairs of vertical and horizontal, ideally, and overlaying that through the center of the rider. And you can see exactly what I described. There's a lot going on the left, on the upper part of the rider's body, and a lot going on the right, on the rider's lower part of the body. So I think this is the opposite of the diagram. Yeah, so in the diagram, the rider's right leg is high, and in this photo, the rider's left leg is high. So it's the opposite of what the sketches were in real life. So this is the opposite force. And then on the right-hand side, you can see where I draw the vertical red line from the middle of the head through the cervical spine, the thoracic, lumbar, down between the seat bones. It angles from the left to the right, putting force into the horse's movement from upper left diagonally down to lower right, which is already what the horse is doing. And then the angle of the rider's pelvis is high on the left, low on the right. Obviously, her right leg is much lower and longer than her left, and her left shoulder is pushing down, her right shoulder lifting up, because that's how we compensate. The blue lines on the horse are showing the direction of force the horse is creating against the rider. So it's an upward force from the hindquarter and an outward to the left force against the rider with the horse's ball. So the box is pushing up on the left and the ball is rolling out on the left. Okay, then we show again the same diagram as the last rider. The leg is lifted on the left, longer on the right. There's the point of balance shifted towards the right side of the pelvis, lower, and off center of the spine. So the line of force that the horse is receiving from the rider is exacerbating the problem that the horse already has. Then the photograph of the person with the striped shirt on the black horse on the upper left is exactly the same as the illustration. The photograph over on the right hand side, the rider with the blue pants, is the opposite imbalance, but more subtle. So you can just see the saddle is really looking pretty centered, and the rider looks relatively level, pretty darn close, right? And the giveaway at first glance is the rider's right leg gripping the horse, where the left leg is hanging, the right foot is lifted, the right calf is gripping, the right thigh. It almost looks symmetrical to the left, but you can see it's a bit flatter from this angle, which means it's tighter. There's a very gentle angle of the where her sweatshirt meets her pants, ever so slightly tipped low on the left, high on the right. Ever so slightly either side of her braid through her shoulders, her right shoulder is ever so slightly higher than her left. It's still the same problem, but that's a more subtle version of the same problem. What matters about it is the horse, how they have to cope with the rider's weight and mass, even as we are slightly out of balance. The more balanced the horse is, the more it matters. When a horse is grossly out of balance, this rider, where I'm showing the subtle version, it would be fine. But as the horse's balance gets better, it's going to become kind of the thing that's getting in the way if we don't refine our balance as the horse balances. So that's why it's good that we all have to learn on horses that are massively out of balance, because by the time they get to their balance, we've trained our own nervous system to pay attention. Now, the photo on the bottom is a horse in canter, and the horse is in extension, super heavy on the left front leg. You can really see the drop of the fetlock, a lot of weight bearing on that left, which should be the leading leg of this canter, and how the horse and rider, the whole barrel, is rolling to the left, and the rider is heavy in the left stirrup. You can see she's falling in with the horse, right? So again, it's just an imbalance, doesn't help the horse. We have to overcome the use of the horse to maintain our own balance. And if the horse is severely out of balance, you feel like that surfer on the shortboard with a huge wave. And if the horse is getting their balance, you feel more like that longboarder that was on a smaller wave. It gets easier. So the forces reduce as the horse gets their balance. So then here are just two interesting illustrations, and I didn't put any lines of force in here yet. I'm not sure if they're needed, but here, if we look at the lower part of the rider, this is a little bit like that photo of the rider with the blue breeches. It's more subtle. So on the left, you can see the rider's legs are a bit off. The tilt of the pelvis is severe, and the compensation is happening more in the upper body than it's happening in the lower body. But the lower body is still being pulled visibly out of balance. On the illustration on the right, you can see the tip of the pelvis is still pretty significant, but the legs look more symmetrical. This is a rider with more experience, but where they're really making up the difference is through the rib cage and the shoulders. So the thorax of the rider is in a huge amount of muscular effort to try to control the imbalance of the pelvis. But they're controlling it enough that the legs look pretty even to each other. One toe is turned out, showing more muscular effort. The other leg looks sort of relaxed in the right position. But the gripping that's going on in the right leg is still the same as when we can see it. This is just a rider who's learned to use muscular effort through the arms and legs to sort of feel balanced. From the horse's perspective, this rider is going to be pretty tight on the reins. even if they have a long rein, they're going to create a backwards feel. Then I put this in because it was so interesting. When I say bodies are bodies, this is a great illustration. Um, this lady she's a great rider. She's very effective with the horses. She rides at a pretty high level, and yet she was having different issues with developing horses, and she was having a lot of back pain. So on the left is just the crosshairs that I sort of initially put over every rider. When I look at a rider from the side, on the left is kind of what I'm putting in my mind towards the center of the rider, somewhere above the pelvis and below the rib cage, middle of the rider. Then I can see, are they ahead or behind? And what's interesting when we look at that, she's both ahead and behind, right? That's a rider that's worked really hard on her position, but kind of at the expense of her effectiveness and her own comfort. So on the right hand side, excuse me, I drew the lines of force. So her spine, you can see the lumbar is pulled forward, which is a typical challenge of female riders. So the shape of her head spine is too far ahead of the vertical. It's that convex shape where from the middle of the head through the chest it goes forward and then back to the seat bones. But she's also learned, and the pelvis is tipped a little bit down in front and up behind. So initially I pulled out this picture to show a rider that was ahead of the vertical, but then I went, wait a minute, her chest is and shoulders are almost behind the vertical. So what she's learned to do is, in following the instruction, look where you're going, shoulders back. She is educated enough to know that her shoulders need to be back, but her pelvis is dropped forward. So this rider is really, and she does have significant back pain. Her shoulders being back is creating a force from back to front, like a rider in the behind the vertical use of their body. But then in the pelvis and the low back, the seat bones, the lumbar, she's creating a force acting front to back, like a rider that's ahead of the vertical. And so it's amazing how in our efforts to get it right for the horse or the human, there are all kinds of configurations of the body. And it's at the expense of our comfort. Like if we're kind of congruent, if we're ahead of the vertical, behind the vertical in our bodies, okay, we all share the same aches and pains. We all have similar problems because the body being used that way needs similar support to continue that posture. And as we go through lessons and we follow different instructors, sometimes the overtraining of the horse or the overtraining of the rider, over efforting, we create these amazing different creative uses of our body. And for this particular rider, it was really painful. She was getting a lot of back pain riding. And you can see why, because her shoulders, her upper body, and her lower body are going two different directions. And the horse is receiving that confusion of feel. And what she was struggling with a lot, which is drawn at the blue line of the horse, is extension, right? So no matter what she was doing with all the skills, and she's a very skilled rider, she's a good rider. This is not to take away from this woman as a rider. But where she was struggling was not figuring out why her horses were not quite right, and kind of being surprised that what they were doing was putting the thoracolumbar spine and the base of the cervical spine in extension. So that was the effect her body was having on the use of the horse. And not for lack of effort and trying and time spent. But this is where we can land, which is why I teach. I'm trying to help people not land here for the sake of the horse as well as the sake of our own health. Okay, so then this group of slides is showing in various uses how we still balance. So the upper left rider in a Western saddle, and she's just a lovely lady, not very tall, and she had this great gaited pony. They were just a match made in heaven. They were at the rescue in Florida. And you can see her balance is pretty good. The horse's balance is pretty good. If I draw the blue line from the point of the hip to the lower cervical, okay, the horse is on the forehand slightly, not too bad. If I put the crosshairs over the rider's middle, her balance is pretty good. Could it be improved? Sure, but it's pretty good. Then the rider on the upper right hand side is just a really good eventer going over this humongous jump. And the yellow line is to show, even just like the surfer who was in that big wave, right? Getting tubed. And that surfer in this same crouched position with nothing to grip, nothing to hang on to, could ride the force of that wave in balance. This is a very similar use of the human body. So the yellow line shows the alignment, even though the rider is looking where they're going, which is important at high speeds over huge jumps, right? The head is in line. The head, neck, spine, thoracic, lumbar, and pelvis are on that straight yellow line. So that rider, the axial skeleton is in a slightly different arrangement to gravity. It's more forward, but the lower part of the body is almost equal to the upper part of the body. So you can sort of see the V shape from the yellow line, and if I drew another yellow line through the thigh bone, you can see there's kind of a V, which the red line of the 90-degree vertical line to gravity goes right through his middle. That's a great photo of a really balanced rider at high speeds over a big jump. It's the same balance as our cute Western rider in a Western saddle on a little gaited pony, right? Then on the lower right-hand side, it's the same balance, even if the horse is going to have a moment, which this horse looks like it's getting ready to do. Same balance in an English saddle, right? And then in the lower left-hand corner, I thought fascinating, also the very same balance if you're driving a cart, and the horses feel it. I have more to come on that cart, the driving photos, because that particular driver drove behind the vertical, and the changes that the horse made when we moved her to the same alignment in the cart that you have when you ride. So whether we're driving, jumping, high speed, slow speed, English saddle, Western saddle, doesn't matter. The use of our body should always be the same organization. And either we're more in a bent position, like the surfer on a big wave, or we're more in an elongated position, like the surfer on a very small wave. Because the forces that we're coping with are more or less. Then this slide is just to show whether it's walk, trot, canter. So the rider on the upper left side with all the lines, the yellow line, and this was the same rider we showed where she was falling left in the other photo, being pulled forward and over to the left by the horse. Now she's got her balance, and it's a bit chicken and egg. Who got it first? Did the horse get their balance first, or did the rider? I always leave it to the rider because the rider speaks English, right? And I teach in English. So the line of the head, the spine, the pelvis is the yellow line. That's quite good. Even though she's in a crouched position, there's a strong, straight alignment. Her torso is not ahead or behind that yellow line. Then if we take the 90-degree vertical line and the 0-degree horizontal line, it goes right through her middle between the pelvis and the rib cage. Very stable. Her point of balance is right where it should be, in the middle of her torso. And then you see the blue line from the horse's hip joint to the lower cervical is maybe slightly downhill, but starting to get more parallel to the ground. That's where the horse's basic balance is: walk, trot, or canter. So same thing on my horse Prima on the lower left-hand side, right? Prima always struggled with canter. It's still a canter, but it's a more upright balance than the rider above with all the lines through it. Both horses are in canter. One is a more sort of upright posture of the rider, where the other one is more of a folded posture of the rider. And then the horse in the middle with the rider. The horse is losing its balance. I think it's a trot. It looks like the rider might be going up into a rise, but the rider's shoulders are level, the feet are level, but you can see the horse is kind of leaning a bit towards its right front leg and stiffening a little on the left, which would put the rider lower in her right leg, and contract her left leg. But this rider is shifted a little bit over the left side of the saddle as a counterbalance. So her feet are pretty level. Her center is a little to the left of the saddle. She's looking where she's going to the right, but as the horse falls right, the rider is still maintaining that vertical horizontal alignment of her skull, spine, pelvis, with her center of her point of balance or center of rotation pretty much where it should be. Then the rider on the far right is in the rise of the rising trot on the top picture, and in the sit of the rising trot in the lower picture. So whether she's in the rise or the sitting phase of a rising trot on this horse, you can see the balance of her axial skeleton is the same. If we put the same crosshairs, vertical, horizontal, and a little red dot for the point of balance, if I did it, I don't know that you could see her, but you can see where it would all line up. So that's how you develop your eye for the balance of the rider. So I'm at almost an hour. I'm going to wrap it up. I still have another evolution to do with this slideshow, but I wanted you guys to be able to go through it this week as much as you wanted. And the final version and a new lesson will be up for next week.